The wind howled across the dry land, stirring up waves of golden dust beneath the fading sun. The old American West was never kind to those who wandered too far from safety, and she had learned that the hard way. The land stretched endlessly, broken only by the rugged hills and the shadow of a distant mountain range that seemed to guard 1,000 secrets. She rode alone now, her worn bonnet pulled low, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if the past might lose her in the dust behind. But the past never let go that easily. Her name was Clara, and not long ago, she had been the daughter of a small-town preacher. Life in the settlement had been simple, filled with prayers, Sunday gatherings, and the faint promise of peace after years of frontier hardship. But peace never lasted long in that wild land. The settlers whispered about raids, about warriors who swept down from the high country to reclaim what had once been theirs. To Clara, those were only stories told by fearful men over whiskey until the night the stories came to life. The flames had come first, then the shouting, and the thunder of hooves that shook the ground like a storm breaking open. Clara remembered her father's trembling hand as he pushed her toward the back door, urging her to run. She remembered the cold breath of the night air, the smell of smoke in her hair, and the shadow that fell across her as she tried to escape. That was when she saw him. He was not like the others. Even in the firelight, there was something different about him. His face was fierce, but not cruel. His eyes, dark and steady, seemed to hold the whole wilderness inside them. He could have let her go. Instead, he took her away with him, silent and sure, as the only world she had ever known turned to ashes behind her. For 9 nights, Clara was kept in a hidden camp, deep within the Apache lands. The people there spoke little to her. They watched with suspicion, but they did not harm her. It was the warrior who had taken Hertha, one they called Tekaduhu, who decided her fate. He was a leader among them, though still young. His voice carried authority, his presence commanded silence. He did not treat her with cruelty, yet she could feel the power he held, the quiet weight of a man who had lived his whole life under the laws of the land, not of men. At first, Clara hated him. She hated the way he looked at her without fear or shame. She hated the sound of his voice when he spoke to the others in a tongue she couldn't understand. Most of all, she hated the strange calm that came over her when he was near. It had taken her from everything she knew, yet she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, the way he spoke to the elders with a quiet respect, it all unsettled her. Each night, the fire burned low, and the desert grew colder. The stars above seemed close enough to touch. Tokoda would sit apart from the others, sharpening his blade, the firelight dancing across his face. Clara could not help but glance his way, even when she told herself not to. Would catch her eyes sometimes, and for a moment she would see something in his gaze, something human, something weary. It wasn't love, not yet, but it wasn't hatred either. It was as if both of them were trapped in something neither had chosen. She began to learn pieces of their language, small words exchanged in quiet moments. Water, food, fire, horse, freedom, each. Word brought her closer to understanding the man who had taken her and the people who lived by the mountains. They were not the savages the settlers had painted them to be. They were proud, bound to the land by tradition, by loss, by survival. Yet to them, she was still the outsider, the settler's daughter, a reminder of the world that had pushed theirs to the edge. On the 5th night, a storm rolled in from the east. The rain came hard, drumming on the hides that covered their shelter. Clara sat alone, wrapped in a blanket he had given her, watching as lightning split the sky. She thought of running, of slipping away into the night while the storm hid her tracks. But when she looked out, she saw him standing in the rain, his shoulders straight, his face lifted to the heavens as if daring the thunder to strike him. Something inside her shifted then. She didn't understand why, but she no longer wanted to run. The next morning, she found him tending to a wounded horse. The animal had been caught in the storm, its leg torn on the rocks. Clara knelt beside him without thinking, tearing a strip from her dress to bind the wound. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. Just two people trying to survive the same merciless world. As the days passed, something fragile began to grow between them. It was not spoken, not named, but it was there in every glance, every small gesture. When he handed her food, his fingers brushed hers longer than necessary. When she spoke a new Apache word correctly, he smiled not with amusement, but with quiet pride. Yet, beneath it all, a shadow remained. She was still his captive, and he was still her captor. The line between them was drawn deep, even if the heart began to blur it. On the 9th night, the air was heavy with silence. The moon hung low, and the wind carried the scent of rain. Clara sat by the fire, her thoughts tangled and restless. Dakota stood across from her, his eyes steady, his jaw tight, as if he too felt something neither could name. Around them, the camp slept. The world seemed to hold its breath, and in that stillness, something changed forever. When morning came, everything was different. Dakota was gone before sunrise, leaving only a carved wooden token beside her Blankatan Apache symbol of protection. The others avoided her eyes, their whispers low and uneasy. Clara felt a weight in her chest she couldn't explain. She had been taken from her home, but now she felt as if another home had been taken from her too. Weeks later, when she was finally found by a passing group of traders and taken back to the nearest settlement, Clara could barely speak of what had happened. The people there looked at her with pity, with judgment, with questions she couldn't answer. They told her she was lucky to be alive, that the warrior must have spared her out of mercy. But she knew better. Mercy was not what she had seen in his eyes. The months passed slowly. The land turned cold again, and life in the settlement returned to its rhythm. Yet Clara could not forget the desert nights, the sound of his voice, or the look in his eyes when he left her. Then one morning, as the first light spilled across her small cabin, she felt something stir within her. A faint movement, a pulse of life that did not belong to her alone. The realization came like the breaking of dawn. Her hand rested over her belly, and tears welled in her eyes. Somewhere beyond the hills, far from the world she had returned to, lived the man who had changed everything. The Apache warrior who had taken her against her will, and yet somehow had also given her something she never expected: life. As she stood by the window, the wind carried a familiar whisper across the plains, soft but certain. It felt as if the land itself remembered. Her heart beat faster, torn between fear and something deeper, something she couldn't name. She did not know if she would ever see him again or what the future held for the child she now carried. But one thing was certain: the story between them was far from over. The days grew longer as spring settled over the valley. Yet for Clara, time moved differently now. She spent most mornings staring out over the fields beyond the small cabin where she stayed, watching the fog lift off the ground as the sun warmed the soil. The traders who had brought her back to the settlement were kind enough to give her shelter, but their kindness had limits. A woman returning from Apache lands carried more than stories. She carried the burden of whispers. The townsfolk spoke softly when she passed. Some pitied her, others looked at her with cold suspicion. They wondered what had truly happened out there, beyond the mountains. Clara said little. There were things words couldn't explain, things the people here would never understand. When she lay awake at night, she still heard the crackle of desert fires and the deep, steady tone of Dakota's voice as he spoke to his people under the stars. She tried to push those memories away, but they returned with every small reminder: the scent of smoke, the beat of hooves on dry ground, the feel of wind against her face. It wasn't just the past that haunted her now. It was the future growing quietly inside her. She could no longer hide the changes in her body. The first time she felt the faint stir of movement, she sat perfectly still, her breath caught in her chest. She knew then that she carried a piece of him, a life neither of them had planned, yet one that tied them forever. There were days when she wanted to hate him again, to curse his name for the confusion he had left behind. But when she thought of the way he had treated her, how he never raised a hand in cruelty, how he had protected her from others who questioned her presence, her anger faded into something else. Something like sorrow. She couldn't name what they had shared in those 9 nights, but she knew it had changed her. It had made her see the world differently, made her realize how deep the divide ran between her people and his. In town, the preacher's wife, a kind woman named Mrs. Ellison, offered Clara work helping with mending and chores. She accepted it quietly, keeping her head low. It was easier that way. The less she spoke, the less they asked. At church, she sat near the back, feeling the weight of curious glances. She prayed not for forgiveness, but for strength to carry what was hers now, and to face what lay ahead. Still, there were nights when she couldn't sleep. When the wind blew in from the west, she thought she heard distant drums carried on the air. Once, She stepped outside barefoot, her nightgown clinging to her as she stood in the moonlight, staring toward the dark line of the mountains. It was foolish, she told herself, to imagine he might be out there still, thinking of her. But the heart has a way of believing what reason cannot. By early summer, rumors began to reach the town of new unrest. A few travelers spoke of rising tension along the frontier, of Apache warriors reclaiming territory, of soldiers gathering to strike back. The settlement buzzed with unease. The men spoke in harsh tones about revenge and justice, about wiping out the tribes once and for all. Clara listened in silence, her stomach tightening with dread. She wanted to speak up, to tell them that not all warriors were cruel, that there was honor and loss on both sides, but her words would only be twisted, her voice dismissed. One evening, as she walked back from the river with a basket of laundry, she found a small group of boys following her. They whispered and snickered, throwing stones near her feet. One called her the Indian's woman. Another said she carried a devil's child. Clara didn't stop walking. She held her chin high and kept her eyes forward, though her heart burned with shame and anger. When she reached her cabin, she closed the door and let the tears fall silently. It was then that she realized how truly alone she was. People she had grown up among saw her as tainted, touched by a world they feared and despised. Yet within her, she carried a reminder of that world. Half of her child's blood belonged to the man they called an enemy. She placed a trembling hand over her belly, whispering softly, "You're not a curse, you're a gift." It was a promise she intended to keep. As the months went on, the heat deepened. Clara worked hard to keep herself busy, mending clothes, tending the small garden behind the cabin, and preparing for the baby's arrival. But every now and then, she caught glimpses of strangers passing through town, trappers, scouts, soldiers. Once she overheard two men in the general store talking about an Apache leader who had been spotted near the river valley. They said he was tall, with a scar across his shoulder, and that he led a small band of warriors who refused to surrender. The name they spoke made her heart stop. Dakota. She waited until the men left before stepping outside, her hands trembling. She stood for a long time, staring toward the far horizon. If he was truly alive and this close, what did it mean? Would he ever come looking for her? Did he even know what she carried? The thought filled her with both hope and fear. She didn't know which one she wanted more, to see him again or to never face him at all. That night, sleep refused to come. Clara sat by the window, watching the moonlight spill over the fields. Every sound seemed louder than usual: the croak of frogs by the creek, the rustle of dry grass, the distant cry of a coyote. Somewhere deep inside, she felt it again, the same pull she had felt back in the desert, a sense that something unseen was moving closer. The next morning, she found fresh tracks near the creek. Hoofprints, too large for deer, straight for the wild mustangs. She knelt down, tracing them with her fingers. Whoever had passed through had done so carefully, but not carefully enough. A chill ran down her spine. She looked around, her pulse quickening, but the land lay still and silent. She told herself it was nothing, maybe a trader or a scout, but doubt settled deep in her chest. The following week, a rider arrived from the fort, warning of possible raids. The soldiers were looking for anyone who might have seen signs of Apache movement. Clara stayed inside, pretending not to hear when they came knocking. She didn't want to betray him, even if she wasn't sure he was really out there. She couldn't bring herself to tell anyone that part of her hoped he was. As the days grew hotter, her strength began to fade. She could no longer hide the roundness of her belly, and whispers in town grew louder. Mrs. Ellison still showed her kindness, bringing her soup and clean linens, but even she couldn't silence the gossip. People said she had sinned, that she had consorted with the enemy, that her child would bring misfortune. Clara bore it all quietly. She had stopped defending herself long ago. Words were wasted on those who had already decided who she was. One late afternoon, as a storm rolled in, Clara sat alone by the fire. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain tapped against the roof. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, staring into the flames. The baby stirred again, stronger this time, and she smiled faintly. The warmth of the fire reminded her of another night, long ago, when she had sat beside Tokotea's campfire, afraid, yet strangely safe. Her thoughts drifted back to his face, to the quiet strength in his eyes. She remembered the way he had given her water when she was too weak to ask, The way he had looked at her as if seeing something more than a prisoner. The memory filled her chest with an ache that words could never hold. Suddenly, the door creaked open. The wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Claire's heart leaped as she turned toward the doorway. A shadow stood there, tall and still against the storm. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. The firelight flickered, catching the outline of a figure she could never mistake. Her breath caught. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure stepped forward slowly, his dark eyes steady on hers, rain dripping from his hair and shoulders. Time seemed to fold in on itself, the distance between past and present vanishing like smoke. Claire's hand tightened over her belly, her pulse racing with both fear and longing. She didn't know why he had come or what it meant, only that nothing would ever be the same again. The storm raged outside, but inside, the small cabin, the world fell silent. The fire flickered low, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The two of them stood there, facing each other across the narrow room, two souls bound by something neither had planned and neither could escape. And as the thunder rolled across the land, Clara knew that whatever was coming next would change everything once more. The rain poured down hard against the cabin roof, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between them. Clara could hardly believe what she saw standing before her. Dakota looked different, older somehow. His face bore new lines, and his eyes carried the weight of battles fought and lost. Yet beneath it all, he was still the same man who had taken her from her burning home, the same man who had left her with a piece of himself that now stirred quietly inside her. He stood there for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and rough, as though he had traveled many miles without rest. "They are coming," he said. "The soldiers. They mean to burn everything. My people will not run again." Clara's heart raced. She didn't know whether to move toward him or step back. "Why are you here?" she managed to ask. Her voice trembled. He looked at her as if trying to find the words that could cross the gulf between their worlds. "Because you should not be here when it happens," he said quietly. "They will not spare anyone." The firelight flickered, throwing shadows across his face. Clara felt her knees weaken as the reality of his words sank in. "You came to warn me?" "Yes," he said simply, "and to see what I left behind." His gaze dropped briefly to her belly, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The sound of thunder filled the space where words failed. Clara turned away, gripping the back of a chair to steady herself. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "If they find you here, they'll kill you." "I have faced death before," he said, stepping closer. "But this is different." His voice softened, filled with something she could not name. "You are carrying my blood." Her eyes met his then, and the storm outside seemed to fade. She wanted to say something, anything, but her throat closed. The air between them was heavy with things unsaid. Fear, anger, memory, and a strange tenderness that neither dared admit. For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped, but a sudden noise outside broke the spell, a horse whinnying in alarm, boots splashing through the mud. Tokoda moved to the window, his body tense. "Soldiers," he whispered. "They're already here." Clara's breath caught. She could see the faint glow of lanterns moving through the rain. "They must have followed you," she said, panic rising in her chest. He shook his head. "No, they are looking for my people. But they will not hesitate to take you if they think you are hiding me." Without another word, he reached for her arm. "We must go," he said. Now Clara hesitated. The thought of leaving everything behind genified her. But the pounding of hooves grew louder, and she knew there was no time to decide. She grabbed her shawl, a small bundle of food, and let him lead her out into the storm. They ran across the field toward the trees, the wind tearing at their clothes. Behind them, the shouts of soldiers cut through the rain. Clara's heart pounded as Tokoda pulled her into the darkness of the forest. They moved swiftly, silent except for the sound of their breathing and the rustle of wet leaves underfoot. By the time they reached higher ground, the lights of the settlement had faded behind them. Tokoda guided her toward a narrow cave beneath a ridge. Inside, it was dry and still, the air thick with the scent of earth. Clara sank to the ground, her body trembling. Tokoda crouched near the entrance, watching the trees below. For a while, neither spoke. The sound of distant thunder filled the silence. Then Clara said quietly, "You shouldn't have come for me. They'll kill you if they find out." He turned to her, his expression unreadable. If they kill me, it will not change what is already true. You carry my child. We're part of my people now, whether you wish it or not. His words cut through her like a blade, not from cruelty but from truth. She looked away, feeling tears sting her eyes. Your people would never accept me, she said, and mine already see me as lost. He studied her face for a long moment. There is a place where blood does not matter, he said softly, where the land decides who belongs. Clara didn't understand, but she didn't argue. She could see how tired he was, the weariness etched into every line of his face. This was not the same man who had taken her months ago. He had seen too much since then, too much loss, too much fighting. When she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she dreamed of flames again, her home burning, Dakota pulling her from the smoke, the sound of a child crying somewhere in the distance. She woke with a start, heart racing, and found him still awake, staring out at the rain. At dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the land soaked and silent. Dakota motioned for her to stay quiet as he stepped outside. Clara followed slowly, leaning against the cave wall for balance. The air was cool and smelled of pine and wet soil. She could see smoke rising far off toward the east, the direction of the settlement. She swallowed hard. They burned it. He nodded. They call it justice. Clara pressed a hand to her chest. It's the people who had taken her in, who had judged her, but still given her shelter. The soldiers had destroyed them in their hunger for revenge. She didn't know what to feel anymore. There was no right side left, no place where she truly belonged. Dakota looked at her with quiet understanding. You see now, he said, they will not stop until nothing is left. She shook her head. There has to be another way. There is no peace in a land that has forgotten how to listen, he said. His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. But there is still a future. For you, for the child. His words brought a strange comfort, even as fear gnawed at her. Where will we go? She asked. To the mountains, he said. There are valleys there where no soldier dares to go. My people will hide there until the war passes. Clara hesitated. And if they don't accept me, he looked at her for a long moment before answering. Then they will learn. They began their journey north, following narrow trails that wound through forests and canyons. The days were long and harsh, the nights cold. Dakota hunted small game, and Clara cooked what little they had over small fires. Her strength faded quickly, and sometimes she had to stop and rest. Her hands pressed to her stomach as the baby grew heavier inside her. One evening, they came upon an old hunter's cabin tucked between two cliffs. The roof sagged, but it was shelter. They stayed there for several nights, gathering what little food they could find. It was during one of those nights that Dakota finally spoke about what had happened after he left her. The soldiers came to the valley, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the fire. They took the land, killed the elders. Many of my people were scattered. I led those who survived into the high country. But they will keep coming. Clara listened, her heart heavy. She wanted to tell him that she understood what it meant to lose everything, but she knew her pain was not the same. Still, in that small cabin, surrounded by silence and flame, their differences seemed smaller than ever. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the cry of a distant bird. Dakota rose and stepped to the door, his posture suddenly alert. They are tracking us, he said. Clara's breath caught. Who? Soldiers, he said. They will not stop until they have proof I am dead. The fear that had followed her since the night he first appeared returned stronger than before. She stood slowly, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. What will we do? He turned toward her, his face calm, but his eyes fierce. We will survive, he said. That is what the land teaches. Always. The firelight flickered, casting their shadows long against the wall. Outside, the storm clouds gathered again, rumbling in the distance. Clara knew that whatever waited for them beyond those mountains would decide everything's their lives. Their child's future and the fragile bond between two worlds that had never been meant to meet. And as the first drops of rain began to fall once more, she realized that the hardest part of her journey was only beginning. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the mountains. The sharp scent of pine filled the air, and the ground was slick with melted snow. Each step became harder for Clara, her breath short and uneven. Dakota walked ahead, scanning the trail for danger, his hand never far from the knife at his belt. The world around them had grown quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. Clara felt the baby move again, stronger than before. It was both a comfort and a warning. Every time the child stirred, she was reminded that she was no longer running only for herself. The mountain paths were steep, and her body ached from the long journey. She tried to hide her pain, but Tokuda noticed. He always did. "We will rest soon," he said, his voice low but steady. She nodded, though her legs trembled beneath her. The sun dipped behind the ridges, turning the sky to a deep orange before fading into gray. They found a narrow ravine where a small stream ran between the rocks. Tokuda led her there and helped her sit near the water. The cold bit at her fingers, but she didn't complain. She had learned that complaining didn't change the land's ways. Tokuda crouched near her, his dark eyes scanning the distance. "The soldiers are close," he said quietly. "They travel by night now." Clara's heart tightened. "How many?" "5, maybe 6, he said. "They follow our trail, but they do not yet know where it leads." The thought of being caught again made her blood run cold. She looked at Tokuda, his face lit by the dying firelight, and wondered if he was afraid. But his expression was calm, as though fear had no place in him anymore. She wanted to ask what would happen if they were found, but she didn't. Some questions didn't need answers, they'd already lived inside you. Instead, she whispered, "Do you think your people are still out there? The ones you led away?" He paused before answering. "Some," he said. "Others have gone to the far desert, beyond the reach of the soldiers. But they will return when the land calls them home. It always does." Clara listened to his voice, deep and certain, and felt a strange warmth rise inside her. Even in the face of ruin, he spoke with faith. He believed the land would remember, that something greater than war still held meaning. She wished she could believe as easily as he did. That night they didn't light a fire. The stars were sharp and cold, scattered across the dark sky. Clara lay beside Tokuda, under a blanket of furs, her head resting against his arm. Neither spoke for a long time. The forest hummed with quiet life, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of water running over stone. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Do you ever think of that night?" He didn't ask which one. "Every day," he said. Clara turned slightly, looking at him through the dim starlight. "If you could go back, would you still take me?" His eyes met hers, unflinching. "Yes," he said, "'cause if I had not, the fire would have taken you. I would still see your face in my dreams, knowing I had left you to die." Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him that his choice had stolen her life too, but the words caught in her chest. Deep down, she knew he was right. The world had already chosen for both of them. In the distance, a faint sound broke through the stillness, the crack of a branch, quick and deliberate. Tokuda's hand went to his knife, his body tensing like a drawn bow. He motioned for silence. Clara held her breath, every muscle rigid. They listened. Another sound followed, closer this time, the muffled steps of boots on wet earth. Tokuda moved quickly, pulling Clara to her feet. "We must go," he whispered. They slipped through the trees, the darkness closing around them. The forest seemed alive with noise now, the rush of the stream, the creak of branches, the sound of men's voices carried faintly on the wind. Clara's heart pounded. She stumbled once, catching herself against a tree. Tokuda caught her arm before she could fall. "This way," he said, guiding her up a narrow path that twisted along the ridge. The climb was steep, and the rocks slick beneath their feet. Clara's legs burned, but she didn't stop. The voices grew clearer below. The soldiers were close enough now that she could hear them shouting orders to each other. When they reached the top, Tokuda led her to a small hollow beneath a rocky outcrop. "Stay here," he said. Clara's eyes widened. "What are you going to do?" He looked down at her, his face hard in the moonlight. "If they find us, they will take you." "I will not let that happen." Fear surged through her. "You can't fight them alone. I have fought alone before," he said. "And I am still here." Before she could say another word, he was gone, moving like a shadow through the trees. She crouched in the hollow, pressing a hand to her belly as if to protect the child within. The sounds of the forest grew sharper, the rustle of leaves, the distant clatter of metal, and then silence again. Minutes felt like hours. The moon slipped behind a cloud, and darkness swallowed the mountains. Then came a sudden burst of noise, shouting, the clash of steel, the sharp crack of a rifle. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to run to him, but her body wouldn't move. Another gunshot echoed, closer this time, followed by a scream that tore through the night. Tears filled her eyes. She could taste the fear on her tongue. She pressed herself deeper into the hollow, praying under her breath for the noise to stop, for Tukota to come back. The baby moved again, as if feeling her terror. She whispered softly, trying to steady her voice. "It's all right. He'll come back. He has to." Then, through the trees, she saw a flicker of movement, a figure stumbling toward her. Tukota emerged from the shadows, his shoulder bleeding, his face pale with exhaustion. She ran to him, catching him before he fell. "They're gone," he said weakly. "For now." She helped him back to the hollow, her hands shaking as she pressed against the wound. The blood was dark and warm beneath her fingers. "You need help," she said. "There is no help," he murmured. "Only time." He closed his eyes, breathing raggedly. Clara tore a strip from her shawl and bound the wound as best she could. The night felt endless, the darkness heavy and alive. Every sound made her flinch, afraid the soldiers would return. When dawn finally broke, pale light filtered through the trees. Tukota was still alive, though his face was drawn and gray. Clara knew they couldn't stay there. The soldiers would come again, and next time they might not be so easily misled. "We have to keep moving," she said. Opened his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. To wherever we can," she said. "As long as we keep going." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Slowly, painfully, he rose to his feet. She helped him as best she could, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Together, they began the slow climb deeper into the mountains. As they walked, the world seemed to shrink around them, the air thinner, the silence deeper. Clara could feel the life inside her growing restless, as if the child knew they were nearing something important, something dangerous. By midday, clouds gathered again, casting long shadows across the peaks. They came upon a narrow pass where the trail split in two. Tukota stopped, his gaze fixed on the northern path. "Beyond that ridge," he said, "is the sacred valley. My people used to go there when they needed to speak to the spirits." Clara followed his gaze. The valley lay hidden beyond the mist, silent and untouched. Felt like a place that had been waiting for them. But before they could move forward, the distant echo of voices rose again. The soldiers. They were coming from both directions this time. Tukota's eyes hardened. "They have found the trail." Clara felt panic rising, but Tukota's calm steadied her. "Listen to me," he said. "No matter what happens, you must keep going. Follow the path north. Do not stop." She shook her head, gripping his hand tightly. "I'm not leaving you." He looked at her, his voice low and fierce. "You carry more than yourself now. That child is the future of both our worlds. You must protect it." The sound of gunfire cracked in the distance, sharp and relentless. Clara's heart pounded as she turned toward the ridge. The storm clouds broke overhead, lightning flashing across the sky. The rain began again, harder than before, washing blood and mud into one. Tukota drew his knife, his stance steady, despite the wound. He looked at her one last time, something deep and unspoken passing between them. Then he turned toward the sound of the soldiers, disappearing into the trees once more. Clara stood frozen, the rain soaking her hair and clothes, her heart screaming at her to run. But she couldn't move, not yet. Somewhere beyond the roar of thunder, she heard him cry out, a sound raw with fury and pain. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears mixing with the rain. The mountains shook with gunfire, echoing across the valley like drums of war. And as the storm raged above, Clara knew she was standing at the edge of everything, the moment where love, loss, and fate would collide, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun rose slow and golden over the wide plains, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. The air was cool, gentle with the smell of wild sage and dust after the storm. She stood at the edge of the Apache village, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the child stirring lightly in her arms. He was small, his skin warm like sunlight, his eyes the same deep brown as his father's. For a long time she just watched the horizon, where the land stretched so far it seemed to never end. Everything that had happened felt like a dream carved into her heart, a story that could never be told in full. The camp was quiet that morning. Many of the warriors had gone to hunt. The old women sat weaving by the fires, their soft voices carrying songs that spoke of courage and loss. She could hear the words now, though months ago she would not have understood them. The language had become part of her life, like the air she breathed. The Apache had taken her from a world she once thought she belonged to, and yet here among them she had learned what survival truly meant. He came to her side without a word, his steps silent as ever. His shadow fell beside hers, tall and certain. When she looked up at him, the years of struggle between them seemed to dissolve like mist. There was a time when she feared him, hated him even, for the way fate had thrown her into his path. But time and hardship had changed that. There was something else between them, not easily named but strong as the land itself. He looked at the child, his expression unreadable. Then he reached out, his rough fingers brushing the small hand that clutched her shawl. The baby made a soft sound, and for the first time she saw his father's lips curve in the smallest of smiles. It was the kind of moment that said more than words ever could. He had fought for his people, for his land, for the right to exist in a world that wanted to erase them. And she had fought for her own sense of belonging, torn between two worlds that could never meet without pain. The war between settlers and tribes had burned across the land, leaving behind ashes and silence. Her own people, the ones she had once known, would never accept what she had become. To them, she was lost, changed, unclean. But here among the Apache she had found truth harsh but honest. They had taught her that the earth did not belong to anyone. It was borrowed from those yet to come. When she thought of all that had happened the night she had been taken, the anger, the fear, the quiet moments by the fire when he had told her stories of his ancestors, she understood something she never could have before. The world was not as simple as good and bad, civilized and savage. It was made of choices, mistakes, and the heavy price of survival. The chief had called her that morning to speak. The raids had ended, the army had withdrawn, the tribe would move deeper into the mountains before winter came. It meant leaving behind what little they had built, but it also meant safety. She had known this day would come. Still, the thought of leaving the valley where her child was born made her heart ache. It was a place of both pain and peace, the start of her new life. He stood beside her as the sun climbed higher. The wind carried the smell of pine and smoke. "You do not have to stay," he said at last, his voice low and careful. "If you wish to return, the trail is open now. No one will stop you." Her breath caught. For a moment, she could almost see it, the road leading back to the world she came from. To the small towns where women wore ribbons in their hair and church bells rang on Sundays. But that world was gone for her. She was not the same girl who had been taken that night. The road back would not welcome her. It would only remind her of what she had lost. She looked down at the child, then up at him. "Where would I go?" she asked softly. "Everything I knew is behind me." He met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "Then stay," he said simply. "The land is harsh, but it is ours. You and the child will be safe here." There was a stillness between them then, a silence full of unspoken truth. She knew what he meant. Safety was never certain. The world beyond would always threaten their peace, but for the first time, she was not afraid of it. The storm inside her had settled into something quieter, something strong. The months passed slowly after that. Snows came early that year, blanketing the land in white. She learned to sew winter clothing from hides, to build fires that lasted through the coldest nights. The women of the tribe had begun to accept her, though it had taken time. They had seen her work, her patience, her willingness to learn, and when her child grew strong and healthy, they called him Son of Two Worlds. At night, when the fire crackled low, she would listen to the drum beats and think about the strange road that had brought her here. She remembered the loneliness, the fear, the moments she thought she would never survive. But she had. Through it all, the man who had once been her captor had become something else. Her protector, her equal. They did not need words for it. The bond between them was made of silence, of shared hardship, and the life they had brought into the world. One evening, as the winter began to fade, she walked to the river with her child. The water was cold, running fast through the rocks. She knelt there, dipping her hand into the stream. The reflection that stared back at her was not the same face she remembered. The eyes were older, wiser, the skin was bronzed by the sun. There was no trace of the frightened girl who had once begged to be free. He came up behind her quietly, his presence steady as the earth. "Spring is near," he said. She nodded, looking at the horizon. "Yes," she whispered.
"Oh."
"A new beginning." He reached out and took her hand. They stood together, the river rushing at their feet, the child laughing in her arms. For the first time, she felt at peace with the world around her. She understood that freedom was not always found in escape. Sometimes it was found in acceptance, in the courage to love despite the pain of the past. The sun dipped low, setting the sky on fire with shades of red and gold. The drums in the village began to sound in the distance, calling everyone home. She turned to him and smiled, and he nodded once, as if to say he understood what she did not need to speak aloud. When they walked back together, the wind carried the scent of new life, of grass growing again, of the earth ready to heal. She knew their future would not be easy, but it was real. The land had a way of testing all who lived upon it, breaking the weak and shaping the strong. As night settled over the plains, she looked back once more at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there was the world she had come from, the one that had cast her aside. But she no longer longed for it. She had found her place not through force or fate, but through the quiet strength that had grown within her. The Apache warrior's child stirred in her arms, his small fingers grasping at her shawl. She kissed his forehead gently, her heart full. The past was gone, but the future was hers to shape. And as the firelight flickered across their faces, she knew the story of their lives would be told for generations. A story not of captivity, but of endurance, love, and the power to begin again.